I'm now with Futrell Fire Consultant Design. I'm a member of SFPE and was involved in the writing of the 2002 edition of NFPA 30. I'm on one of the technical committees, the discharge committee, and so have gone to a number of meetings. Corey Bates sat in on one of the meetings, and so have been involved in the development of this document. And so what I'm going to talk about, obviously, that's why we have so many people here, is the changes on the 2000 edition of NFPA 13. But at the same time, I'm going to try and educate you a little bit on something else, because it's becoming much more important that you know about our building and fire codes in Minnesota. You cannot just get by installing sprinkler systems carrying around NFPA 13. Once we adopt a new code in Minnesota, it's going to be much more important that you have the building and fire codes and you reference them, because they are now going to make more changes, more substantial changes and amendments to NFPA 13. So it's going to be very important. And so I actually am starting out by letting you know how we get to adopt NFPA 13 in Minnesota and what those changes are going to be with the latest edition we're going to adopt. Many of you have heard we have some international codes, or I-codes, coming. And those are a product of years of work combined with some of our different national model code organizations, and they've put together a family of codes, a building code, a fire code, mechanical code, that are all meant to work together, which is something in the past we have not had in Minnesota. A family of codes that provisions in one code fall in line, and reference numbers in one code fall in line with another code, which will make things much easier. So where are we with adopting the new code and eventually a new edition of NFPA 13? About 2000, the middle of 2000, we started work on adopting a new code, building and fire code in Minnesota. Those committees sent out letters to lots of people saying, hey, send us your ideas, send us information. And those committees met and looked at all of the different proposals that were submitted by people. And the goal was to have that done by 2001. Well, we still don't have a new fire code yet, but we're very, very close. On a fire code, there was published in the State Register a few weeks ago the notice, the formal notice that we're getting ready to adopt a new fire code. And that notice was printed in what's called the dual format, meaning if 25 people say, I want a hearing, I don't like what you're doing, I want to change what you're doing, the state goes and has a hearing on that code we're adopting. If not, it's all set to go and a date has been set for the implementation. Comments on the fire code are due this Friday. So some of you in previous meetings, in the discussion sections of our meetings, probably I think it was 2 months ago, we even commented and talked a little bit about the fire and building codes being adopted and what editions of NFPA 13 and 72 we are adopting. If you have an interest in that and want to make comments, you have until Friday to do that. It appears at this point in time, though, that there have been enough requests for hearing, at least on the fire code, that right now the best estimate is that we'll be having a hearing December 3rd, which puts us at somewhere after the beginning of the year for a new fire code. The building code, folks, the same spot. They published their notice of intent to adopt a new building code, the International Building Code, and they have a 30-day comment period, which closed about 2 hours ago, 2.5 hours ago. So it looks like most of the documents, the state building codes folks are going to be adopting, are going to go to a hearing, which means that will delay somewhat our adoption of a new code in Minnesota. Here are all the codes state building codes is looking at. They have the International Building Code. Many of you are interested in this, what's called 1306. You may have heard that. Some communities adopt this document or this amendment section to the building code, and they're allowed to reduce the thresholds for sprinklers. So in those communities that have adopted 1306, you may see many more building sprinkler than you would somewhere else. So, okay, Rich, that's great. You've got a new fire code right here and a new building code you're getting ready to adopt. And you know, why is that important for me as an installer or contractor or enforcer of the fire and building code? Well, the first thing for sprinklers, you're going to see many more instances of sprinklers being installed due to the international codes. One of the big ones that people are starting to find out about is corridor construction. There's a really neat provision in there that says, well, if you sprinkler a building and you have an assembly, a business, or an educational occupancy, you no longer need to have these rated corridors everywhere, which if you talk to the architects or the builders, you know, they clutch their chest when it comes to some of these rated corridors with all the dampers, the self-closing doors. You never can get it constructed right. The building official tells me I have to move this, penetration seals, all these things. And so in those buildings now that are sprinklered, you no longer have to do all that corridor construction stuff. And so you're going to see many more buildings that are, say, two-story office buildings, the plain, you know, those plain mom-and-pop office buildings that would have never gone in with sprinklers before. This is another incentive to get those types of buildings sprinklered under the international codes. You're going to see a lot of the thresholds reduced. And here again I say proposed because these are proposed amendments. There still is a possible hearing. Things could change. But based on the best estimates right now, here are some of the new thresholds for sprinklering buildings under the I codes. Occupant load in assembly occupancies. Occupant loads greater than 300 people. You sprinkler the building. If that assembly occupancy is above or below grade, or the level of exit discharge, you sprinkler it. That's new. That's something good. Factory and industrial buildings. We never really had sprinkler requirements for a lot of these buildings. Many of them were sprinklered because of insurance, because of the size. But now, if you have a factory or industrial building greater than 12,000 square feet, it's sprinklered, as will all institutional occupancies. Mercantile occupancies greater than 12,000 square feet, greater than 3 stories, greater than 24,000 square feet, accumulative on all floors. Those are going to be required to be sprinklered. Residential occupancies, most hotels, boarding houses, those dormitory type occupancies, those will be sprinklered. Apartments, the thresholds have been lowered and the wording has been changed. That's a big one. More than 2 stories, including basements. Before, we had a lot of buildings that were 2 stories with a basement that were apartments. Those were never sprinklered. They will now be. That's a lot of what we build for apartments. Residential assisted living type occupancies where we have people with special needs. The threshold's been reduced to 8 occupancies. Now compare that, I mean, we're pushing these thresholds down more and more. Compare that to a building I saw just starting construction in Sweden. This is a high-rise, 55-story residential tower. Okay, this wonderful building with $1 million apartments in it. In Sweden, you're allowed to build this type of building unsprinklered. And so what the designers did, they went, hey, wait a minute, we should probably still sprinkler this building. So they're going to sprinkler it, but what they did was they said to the building official, we'll sprinkler this building, but we want to get rid of one of the 2 exits. So this building is, halfway built already, will be sprinklered, but they will have used that as a trade-off to only have a single exit, single stairway in a 55-story building. So our reducing these thresholds down just improve the safety all that much more. 12,000 square feet on or more, or 24,000 square feet on all stories for storage occupancies. Now you're going to sprinkle those. Many more fire alarm systems are going to be required under the international codes. But there's a big exception. If you sprinkler the building, a number of those go away. Except in residential occupancies, you have to check the amendments. There's a lot of what-ifs. But here's another incentive for sprinklering buildings, is that, gosh, I don't want to spend all that money for the alarm system at the same time. We'll use the sprinkler system as lots of heat detectors, and now we have our alarm system. There's even more trade-offs. If you have an assembly, business, or educational occupancy, and there's quick response sprinklers in that facility, you no longer need fire extinguishers. Here's just another thing we can use to sell sprinklers. Any of you trying to get ready to make some business decisions ought to kind of start listening about the 2003 International Fire Code, which would be the next one we would adopt in the next cycle, or what is a supplement to that document. Basically, all residential occupancies other than 1 and 2 family dwellings would require sprinklering under that document. So it's coming. It's coming very, we may modify it a little bit in Minnesota, but for those that, hang plastic pipe, there's going to be a lot more business in a few years. Here are the standards that we are proposing to adopt currently in Minnesota. And this is what leads us to tonight's presentation. Currently, we're proposing to adopt the 1999 edition of NFPA 13, 99 edition of the other 13 standards, 96 of 14, 99 edition of the alarm code, the 1998 edition of NFPA 25. Wait a minute, Rich, we've never adopted NFPA 25 before in Minnesota. Well, under the international codes, the language will say you have to meet NFPA 25. Now, some people are going, ooh, that scares me, or ooh, that's good. The way the language has been written is that you still only do the inspection once a year but that inspection you do once a year is done according to NFPA 25. So it's the same language we've had before saying you inspect a sprinkler system once a year, but we never really had good guidance telling you how to do that. And so that means all of those provisions that's happened quarterly or semi-annually, you don't go out and do 4 times a year or twice a year. You just do everything that 1 time a year when you go inspect the system. Compare that, some of the other standards we're adopting, the propane folks were very vocal and came in and talked to a lot of the committees writing the codes. They have the latest edition that is being adopted. And so if this is something, if you feel that after tonight's presentation, the 2002 edition of 13 or 72 or any other standard, you still have a couple more days in which to make a comment. And as we go along here, I have a lot of information. I want to try and give you a general introduction to the standard and cover a lot of things. But certainly, if you do have questions, we'll keep it, keep it as interactive as we certainly can. So, what are some of these amendments we are going to make that are going to impact NFPA 13, whether it is the 99 edition or the 2002 edition that you're using? Obstructions. There's actually language now in the fire code that supersedes or is higher in authority than the installation standard, NFPA 13, that covers kiosks, booths, displays, things you'd have in a shopping mall. So if those are something you're going to have to design for, check the fire code. That's going to alter how you would cover it. Limited area domestic systems, there's some language in the fire code. And we've had this language before, but it was buried. Now it is very clear in the code. If you have a building of undetermined use, you're going into the building or fire official and saying, well, they don't know what they're going to do, whether they're going to make rocket motors in there or whether they're going to sell things or whatever. The minimum design for that is ordinary 2 over 3,000 square feet. Yes?
How international is international?
International means United States, the continental United States. When you take this code outside the U.S. and show it to people, they say, so I'm supposed to build a hut in Africa with this, I'm supposed to design a all-concrete building in Europe with this, I'm supposed to design it. It's a U.S. code. They just got to the name international first. You would see some provisions in there start to possibly, you may see this code adopted in, they may change language, maybe also publish it in Spanish so that you could use it in another country in our hemisphere. Or, Canada, they have their own rules. And so it's international as long as you're in the U.S. Good question.
Well, that only creates a follow-up question. What about the international code coming out of Boston, which directly competes head-to-head with this?
Oh, yes. Well, that other international code, it has provisions, is similar. It's a family of codes just developed by a different group that the different code writing groups were initially working together, and due to a number of reasons, everyone has their opinion, they went their own ways. They too have a code. In Minnesota, at least, the saying that has been used by the enforcement community is, the reason they call it NFPA 5000 is that's the year it will be adopted in Minnesota. Okay. There's special design criteria for sprinklers now in the fire code. So if you have any one of these occupancies that, every time, in the past, sometimes a sports arena or a gym or a wrestling room or a chemistry lab, everyone would come up with different numbers. These were kind of the numbers the state fire marshal used as guidelines when doing plan reviews, and so those have been brought into the code. So because the fire code is higher in authority than NFPA 13, when you do hit upon one of these, it's a minimum ordinary hazard group 2. Wrestling mats, due to the foam mats, chemistry labs, due to guys doing things, teachers doing things like this in the laboratory, and so there's some minimum design you have to meet. Hazardous materials. If you have hazardous materials you're designing for, and there's not a whole lot of guidance in 13 on those, ordinary hazard group 2 over 3,000. That's in our current code, but it was buried. It'll be a little clearer now. Flammable and combustible liquids, we're doing something different. NFPA 30, the 1996 edition is what you'll find, where you'll go to find your design guidance. And there's data in Chapter 34 of the IFC that basically is more stringent or requires more than NFPA 30. So you have to check both documents when you have a flammable or combustible liquids job. Plastic containers, and these big plastic containers called IBCs, or intermediate bulk containers, if they contain flammable or combustible liquids, there is no guidance in either of these two documents that we felt comfortable with. And so there's specific language now that says when you have plastic containers, big plastic containers, you either have to have test data or you go to a national standard, meaning maybe the 2002 edition of NFPA 30 or an FM standard. And so when you have things in plastic containers, that will just require you to go find a couple other books. So that's kind of the background. Just a lot of people think magically NFPA 13 is adopted, or I can now buy this book. That's what everyone should be using in the state. No, there's actually a much more formal process for making a given standard, whether it's the 1999 edition or the 2002 edition of 13. Legal, the law, or what a fire or building official can enforce. So any of you that attended that Minneapolis meeting in May of NFPA, or attended the voting, this edition of 13, 13R, 13D, they were all voted on here in Minneapolis and approved. After that, though, there were a lot of folks that didn't like how the voting went, as usual. And so there were quite a few appeals. That delayed a little bit this standard getting out. It changed some things radically in the standard, some of the appeals. And so even if you followed that voting that day, or what had gone on up to that point, you may find a few things different in the current standard. Here are the folks, or some people might say clowns or whatever, that wrote this standard. They fall into one of 5 different groups. There's a task group that meets, that writes all the residential provisions. And so they do 13D and 13R. There's a group that handles all the discharge criteria. This is how much water you put on the fire, how you can install sprinkler heads, minimum pressures, minimum densities, those types of things. That's the group I attend all their meetings. Hanging and bracing, that's the earthquake people. Installation criteria. These folks, they're probably, most of the changes you're going to see came from this installation criteria group. They're going to help you in a number of cases. There's going to be a few other cases where you're going to see that I'm not too happy about what they did. And private water supply, NFPA 24 and all that underground water main type of stuff came into the code, the last edition, and so those folks have their own group that will meet. So how much is new, Rich? I'm going to spend, how much on the new standard? $38.47 on a new copy of this standard. What's new? Well, you're going to find most of these changes are housekeeping. There was a new manual of style. NFPA wants all of their standards to look the same and feel the same. And so they're going to have a numbering format without the dash. I mean, everything's renumbered so that if you look at the International Building Code or NFPA or any other documents, they're all going to use the same numbering sequence, which will make things a little bit easier. All right, who likes the metric system? All right, the people from outside the country like the metric system. Oh, sorry. I prefer ergs and slugs and dynes and what are they, fathoms? No. We just missed having a metric standard. Actually, there was a draft. The first draft that came out was in metric. And enough people said, can't do it, it's going to give me chest pain, that the committee was given till the 2006, the next edition, to have it all in metric. Everything else we had to do, all the formatting and that, had to be to meet the manual style. But because so much in the fire protection systems area is English unit driven and the manufacturers, that everyone is not ready for it, we were given another 4 years. The 2006 edition will be in metric, so you will have a 24.5 millimeter inch pipe, not a 1 inch pipe. Okay? The problem is, how do we convert that stuff? Do we do it exact, so it's 25.4132 inch pipe for your 1 inch pipe? Or do we just say it's a 25 millimeter pipe and forget all the other stuff? That's a very difficult problem to figure out. But those of you that have kids in school, have them start teaching you the metric system. Just start thinking about it. Yes?
Why 2006? Why
That's the next edition of the standard that will be coming out, and the committee was given one edition of the standard to let everyone know that it was going to be in metric, to get ready for it, to let the manufacturers know that all their data sheets should start reflecting metric.
What's the true benefit?
There's actually stuff that's happening outside the fire protection community that is driving us to metric. For international standards, for example, for the U.S. to compete against Canadian pipe manufacturers or Korean pipe manufacturers, or for us to participate in international standards development, our standards have to be in metric. So there's actually forces outside of NFPA, outside of building segment, that are driving a lot of this. It's international commerce. I want to be able to sell my same sprinkler head here and in the UK. Why do I have to manufacture two separate ones?
Does that mean that the sprinkler pipe is going to be metric?
No, it does not mean necessarily we're going to have 40 millimeter pipe instead of 1.5 inches. What's going to probably happen, this is that whole hard to soft conversion. You're still going to have a 1-inch piece of pipe in your hand. You'll just no longer call it 1 inch, it's going to be 25 millimeter.
But your
Or
space is
so.
still going to be feet and inches.
No, you'll have those heads spaced 3.3 meters, not 10 feet. It'll still be the same heads, the same listings. You won't go back and redo all of your testing. You won't have to get new dies to cut different pipe, but we're going to start calling things different.
What about the water?
Yeah, the water will know it's now under the metric system. So water will flow in liters, not gallons per minute. So it knows. We've already talked to the water. There are no longer exceptions. Reading the code, it's going to be much more important to not just read the section you're going to, read the sections after it. No longer is it going to say sprinkler the whole building except non-combustible concealed spaces, except basements or something like that. It's going to say sprinkler all buildings. The next code section will say you do not need to sprinkler the following, and so there's going to be no more exceptions. It's all code language. So that's been carried over into paragraphs after it. So some of these code sections that had 10 or 11 exceptions now are a paragraph with 10 or 11 paragraphs following it. The layout has been reformatted. There's no more 1/2 inch or 3/4 inch sprinkler heads. It's all by K-factor. Because we had enough people with confusion with K-factors, this is really kind of thought, how many editions have they been messing around or screwing around with the format of the code? All right. There's a lot of people that say, all right, the committee, this is your last chance. You really need to get this document in a format where it's going to stay that way for a number of years. Technical changes, yeah, there's some technical changes. One of the things, though, was because of the major reformatting change of the code, a lot of technical issues are going to be held to the next edition. So you'll see a few things that I'll point out. Some things are different with ceilings, the SFR sprinklers, solid shelves. A few of you are going to get clobbered. Some TIAs, and there's a lot more design criteria. So a lot more options for how you can protect buildings. Many more chapters. The content has been divided up into smaller chapters. So instead of these huge chapters that covered soup and nuts, each topic now has its own chapter, which will make things a little bit easier. There's mandatory references now separated out into their own chapter. Classification of commodities is its own chapter. System components and hardware, that's the same as the chapters you've been used to in the past. Hanging and bracing, underground piping. That material was scattered throughout the 1999 edition. That's all in its own chapter. Design approaches. This is area density curves. That's all in its own chapter, as is storage. There's all those extracts, all that weird design criteria for cooling towers, or that weird type of oxidizer storage. That's in its own area. Let's see. All these water supplies, hose streams, that's all in its own chapter. There are no longer appendix chapters. Appendix is a body organ. We're international. It's annex. So everything now is Annex A, Annex B, Annex C. Annex A is the same thing you're used to Appendix A. That's stuff that normally sometimes you can get away with, but fire and building officials sometimes enforce anyway. It's the fuzzy stuff. There's a lot of miscellaneous good information that's been assembled in Appendix B. Test data, there's now, 20, 30 pages of test data for rack storage in Appendix C. That will help you if you have a discussion with a code official, for example, about flue spaces. You can actually go back and read the test data that led to that code requirement, which will help, because that will help in interpreting. Not all of the data from the test makes it into the code language, and so there's still some questions. Non-mandatory references down in Annex E. Chapter 1, that's the same as we've been used to. Some things on retroactivity, equivalency. So if you have a new design or a new storage configuration that you have special test data for, all that language is basically the same. The reference standards in 13, so telling you how to manufacture pipe, how to do your welding, those are all basically the same, just updated to the new additions of each of those. Those were just number changes. There's a big question. If you have an issue with any of those reference standards in 13, those welding standards, the pipe manufacturer standards, you need to talk to the code official sooner as opposed to later. There's actually language in the IBC and the IFC that says when you leave the building and fire codes to go to another standard, those standards in this don't apply. You don't extend beyond. Otherwise, people would leave this document, go to an ASTM standard, then jump to an ISO standard, and so where did it stop? You basically have to meet every book in the world, because every book would reference somebody else. And so it's basically saying, when you leave the building and fire codes to go to another document like 13, that's where you stop. And so it's going to make it a little more difficult in how we handle issues relating to the standards adopted in 13. There's a number of new definitions. If you can believe it, previous editions of the standard never really had a good definition of automatic sprinkler. I mean, there's a definition of spray sprinkler, sidewall sprinkler, but when it truly came to saying, this is a device that opens up upon heat and applies lots of water to the floor, there was never really a definition like that. There's a new definition for what's called automotive components on portable racks. I'm going to have a few more slides on that. The code is becoming more specific. People that spend money to pay to have fire tests done are getting that material moved into the code, and it applies to just them. And so I'm going to have a half dozen of those cases. Bathroom is defined now to include a room with only a toilet, so thank you. Reinforced plastic pallets. A ton of money was spent on this issue with fire testing, and so we're going to have some things we're going to have to do. If you have anyone you work with that has plastic pallets, there's some changes that will help and some changes that may hurt depending on what you're doing. We have a new type of sprinkler coming out. We have a few examples of it already, and so there's new classifications. That's called a specific application control mode sprinkler. So it's control mode, it's not ESFR, it's not suppression based, it's still meaning we're going to open up a lot of heads around what's burning and keep it from spreading, but it's specific application in that it works for a single commodity, the design is real specific, and the manufacturer or the listing is telling me, design this for 16 heads at 27 PSI. So it's not area density, it's not 0.6 over 2,000, but it's real specific to the commodity. For example, there would be some specific application control mode sprinkler data for protection of plastic pallets that would tell you, use this specific head with this specific K factor at a specific pressure, and designed for X number of heads, not X number of square feet. Finally, we've clarified all of these definitions for ceilings. I mean, how long did we have to wait for this? Flat? Horizontal, flat just means flat can be any one of these, right? Horizontal is this room, all right? Slope not exceeding 2 and 12. So we can have a little bit to get the water off the roof and still have it called flat, meaning we can use our extended coverage heads under that. That helps out a little bit. Slope, greater than 2 and 12. Okay, good, I can live with that. Smooth. This was a problem with extended coverage heads. What was smooth and where can I use them? And people would sometimes get them installed in a space and somebody would come in and say, well, that's no longer smooth, and so you can't use extended coverage heads in that space. That's what they're listed for. So it's free from significant irregularities, so that has really clarified it, that, not significant. You'll see in a minute that it will be a lot easier for these weird ceilings. And my personal favorite, concrete T construction. We have now a definition for concrete T construction, and that it's obstructed construction. We would normally think that big legs hanging down like this would be obstructed, not smooth, and so that's good. If you have a building with bar joists, and after the fact, after you hang your sprinkler piping, somebody comes in and sprays lots of fireproofing on that, such that 30% of the cross section is blocked, Now you have obstructed construction. You may have to move heads. You need to find out in advance if there's going to be spray-on fireproofing in that building. Solid shelves. If you are used to the FM Global, not FM, FM Global standards, that's what we've brought into the code, basically. If you have slatted, wire, mesh, other types of things in the rack, defined by an aisle or a flue space on all four sides. So if you have no longitudinal flue space, the area of that solid shelf is the entire depth of your double row rack, for example. If it's an area less than 20 square feet in the solid obstruction, that's still an open rack with flue spaces on all four sides. And if your openings are greater than 50%. Let's see, Chapter 4, General Requirements. This is a pretty short chapter, nothing new. Level of protection, you still sprinkler all areas. The one thing is an owner's certificate. Those of you that submit plans to the State Fire Marshal's office a couple years ago noticed there was a new plan review information form that required you to supply lots of information about the system, the storage height, where the water's coming from, are you creating the water, using the swimming pool, all that type of thing, and give that for the plan reviewers. Well, for the installers, there's now an information sheet for you. It's called the owner's certificate. And it's a two-page document in the standard. You could add more to it. They give some guidance for what it should be. If you're filling out the form for the fire marshal's office, I think you should probably have most of it in there. But the owner needs to tell you about what they're doing, how they're storing it, a preliminary plan, rack layout, storage, commodities, and hazard, and it has to be certified and signed by the owner or the agent. Yeah, I'm hearing, yeah, right. I think it even says water supply in there, and so good luck on that. Commodity classification. There's one new commodity classification for wax, candles, and blocks of wax, being Group A plastics. That's the only really thing I think new to the table. Oh, and those fireplace logs that come in a little package that you can put in. I think there's a classification there for now. Language that clarifies when we have mixed storage. If you have mixed commodities, if you're storing plywood and metal pump parts, you protect to the highest hazard, the wood, the plywood. But you're allowed to have up to 10 pallet loads of a higher hazard commodity mixed in, well mixed, so that none of them are touching. They're randomly dispersed. So in your entire warehouse with rack storage, you can design it to a Class 1 commodity and then have just a few pallet loads of Class 3 commodity for their boxes or something like that in the building and not have to design it for that higher hazard commodity. You're limited to 5 pallet loads if you're just sprinklering to Class 1 and 2 and your higher hazard is a Class 4 or plastic. So this means you can basically have a few pallet loads and not get clobbered for the whole building. At the same time, this is telling you, no, you can't have 5% of the building or 10% of the building higher hazard. This means a couple pallet loads in the entire warehouse. Any more than that, and you pick the higher hazard. Bill?
An associated chapter explaining on how you monitor and police that and where you acquire the funds to do that?
Well, there you go. Exactly. That's an enforcement issue, no different than any other one. But at least during the design, if all they have is metal parts, and you know somewhere they got to have some shrink wrap or a stack of pallets or a stack of boxes to put those metal parts in, you need to find out in advance, well, how many pallet loads are you really going to have? This was in the 99, the wording's changed a little bit, but it was something that not a lot of people caught, and so that's a big one that can ruin your day. In-rack sprinklers, this was an amendment, thank you. After dealing with lots of big box stores, I got frustrated having a sprinkler head over that one section of rack with the higher hazard, nothing the rest of the way down the rack. Now, the in-rack sprinklers have to extend beyond the higher hazard. So if they say, I just have one section of rack right here where I'm going to have my nasties, and you can't just put one sprinkler head over it. You have to continue down the rack. You don't have to go over the aisle, but at least down the rack, so that the fire that's generated by that higher hazard commodity cannot drive the fire in the lower hazard commodities on either side and make it worse. Plastic pallets, here's the big deal stuff. If you deal with plastic pallets, this is going to change how you work. Wood and metal pallets, nothing's changed there. That's already assumed in the classification of the commodity. When we test a Class 1, a Class 4 commodity, whatever it is, we do it on wood pallets. Therefore, if you use wood pallets, you're fine. If you have reinforced polypropylene or high-density polypropylene, very easy to tell, right? Here. That's a 2-class increase. So if you put metal pump parts on this type of pallet, you're actually designing for Class 3 commodity. The problem is these reinforced pallets like this that have metal reinforcement in them hold together longer, and so they allow that plastic material to burn longer. They don't allow the commodity to fall out of the rack onto the floor and out of the fire and lower the hazard. And so it was found by a lot of testing, and I'll show you some of that testing in just a second, that's a much higher hazard than we had thought, two-level increase. There's supposed to be marked somewhere on the pallet saying it's reinforced. I don't know what the symbol is, I haven't seen one yet. But, oh, wait a minute. Somebody else said, aha, but I have special test data for plastic pallets that if you use a K17 sprinkler head, it's only a 1-class increase. So this is the first time, and there's going to be probably a dozen slides where now things are a function of K factor. Things that we normally look at as an enforcement issue, what type of pallet you're using or that, now are a function of the K factor you're using of the sprinkler head. Somebody had some great test data that because that head performed very well, gave them large enough drops, they were able to control the fire. So if you do use a K17 sprinkler, it's only a 1-class increase. If you have non-reinforced polypropylene or high-density polyethylene, it's a 1-class increase. That's kind of the normal plastic pallet we may see. If you have something else and you don't know what it is, the standard says you have to go test that in the laboratory or protect it as two classes. If you have a specially listed pallet according to UL 2335, and they now have a special test standard, then that's the same as wood. Even though it's made out of plastic, it's a wood pallet. There's no change in the commodity classification. The most common you're going to see is GE. They're the ones that spent all the money to do all this testing and get this code change in the standard. Here's one example of their fire-rated, warehouse-friendly, whatever you want to call it, pallet. But you will see it listed as meeting a UL standard. That's a wood pallet then for the design. You're looking at me like I'm just, tough. Is this? If you have a Group A plastic, you're already protecting the plastic, so go ahead, use a plastic pallet. Doesn't matter. Ralph Peterson's favorite section is the sprinkler identification code. Now it's just formalized in the standard. Before the 99, it was a section that said, by January 1st of 2001, you'll have these numbers on the sprinkler code. Now it's in the code as base code language. Too bad Dave Stringfield is not here. He submitted an amendment. He's on the 72 committee. This language used to be buried in 72, but it's a sprinkler installation issue, so he got it moved over to 13. When you have a system and a pressure-actuated alarm on a sprinkler system, you need to use some corrosion-resistant pipe of a minimum dimension of 3/8 inch. So that was just something that used to be in 72. A sprinkler installer would have never known about it. Now we should at least know it. You guys can hear me in the back? Okay, I don't have to use a silly mic. Dry pipe systems. Don't look here yet. Don't look here. Let's make a fun one. You're allowed to exceed 750 gallons if you use a fancy calculation program that calculates the delivery time. And the standard tells you, if you use one of these listed fancy calculation programs, how many sprinklers you assume open and how fast the water has to be delivered. So if I use this listed program for a high-piled storage freezer with high-piled storage in it, I assume 4 sprinklers are open because that's how much air we want to let out. We don't want to say all the sprinklers are open because that'll let the air out too quick and that'll cheat. So we said, you can open 4 and you have to have water out in 40 seconds. So if you can calculate it that way, then you don't have to prove it the old-fashioned way by opening it up and sitting there with your stopwatch. Okay? Some of you will remember in the 84 edition, there used to be a statement in there that said, you can divide a dry pipe system up with check valves. If you have a problem meeting the time, or it's a tree, a double tree or something, put a check valve in either one, help yourself out meeting the 60-second time to get water out in a dry pipe system. I don't know how this one got in. I mean, I don't think there was a lot of people coming in saying these check valves are freezing or they're corroding, therefore the dry systems are not working. but it's just a general feel that, as these systems get larger, as we allow extended coverage heads, people are storing higher, that with dry pipe systems, the installation committee no longer felt that this was appropriate. So, under the 2002, you're not allowed to use check valves to subdivide a dry pipe system. In the 99, the 96, there was no guidance. It didn't tell you either way. So everyone basically said, aha, it doesn't say I cannot do it, therefore I can. And so this was just to clarify. Antifreeze systems, if you want to use antifreeze in an ESFR sprinkler system, it has to be specially listed. What they found is, hey, a lot of these antifreeze systems are flammable. The actual liquid is flammable. So if I dump that out of the sprinkler system, if it's a control mode system, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference. But if I'm trying to control the fire and suppress it, the heat release rate or the energy given off by that antifreeze was just enough that I could no longer control the fire with a couple sprinkler heads, and so we no longer had early suppression, therefore the ESFR systems failed. So you have to use some special antifreeze. There used to be an appendix section note that said, gosh, you really shouldn't use an antifreeze system greater than 40 gallons. Some people tried to enforce that. There's really no logic behind it other than cost or size of system, and so that was removed. Normally, we hope that upright sprinklers are installed with the frame arms parallel to the pipe. There now is a section, some folks came out with some heads that, well, for some reason, they want to install them with the frame arms not parallel to the pipe. And so if they're listed that way, you can install them however you want. And there's a certain sprinkler head that uses that, that needs that amendment in the code in order to work, because it tells you in certain cases, orient the sprinkler a certain way on the pipe. If you have an area that requires quick response sprinklers, but you have a high temperature next to a heater or something, you can actually use standard response sprinklers, for example, in a light hazard occupancy, where there's another reason why you'd have to use like a high temp, something other than ordinary temperature. A lot more in the standard on residential sprinklers. Actually, things from 13R and 13D have been carried over into the standard, like separation distances, how far apart you should keep whatever it is from heat, distance to heat. I regret to inform some people that you cannot install a sidewall sprinkler head at the bottom of a slope and have it spray up. The heat goes to the top and comes back down, and it's too late. So that doesn't work. The acceptable ceiling constructions have been clarified for light and ordinary hazard for sidewall sprinkler heads, which should make it a little easier. ESFR sprinkler heads, if you are using them under obstructed ceilings, not just concrete T, but any type of obstructed ceiling, you have to check the code very carefully. There's new language based on a TIA that was passed, oh gosh, in '99, something like that, that says if the depth of the structural member is greater than 12 inches, you install sprinklers in every single bay or every single obstruction. And at the same time, with ESFR sprinklers, you still have to meet spacing rules. So 10 feet apart, minimum distances apart, coverage areas, which means there are some buildings where ESFR sprinklers just cannot be installed due to the fact that you'd have to have really wide stem spacing in order to be able to put a head in each bay and still meet your minimum spacing requirements. Okay? So if you have a building with depth of member greater than 12 inches in ESFR, watch that one, because there may not be a solution for your problem with ESFR heads. Skylights. Okay, we have a policy in Minnesota we've been using, put together, worked pretty well. State Fire Marshal policy on skylights and similar ceiling pockets. Now that's all in the code, so that will help us. Some of those policies maybe can go away. Your 4x8 skylight, you're allowed to have it, and it doesn't exist for the purposes of the standard as long as you got 10 feet to another one. It's not there. If you have heads underneath a smooth ceiling, and if we call this a smooth ceiling, the language has been changed a little bit, that head has to be between 1 and 12 inches below the ceiling throughout the area of coverage of the sprinkler, meaning throughout that whole area, you have to be between 1 and 12 inches of the ceiling, which is a problem with stepped ceilings like we see in maybe a lot of tenant fit-out for shopping malls. And so there's new guidance on stepped ceilings, meaning we don't meet that other stuff, being within 1 and 12 inches of the ceiling, if the following apply. Light and ordinary hazard, non-combustible or limited combustible, like this ceiling. Limited combustible has been defined much better now, so there may be some materials that before you were calling combustible, but now we can call limited combustible. If the change is greater than 36 inches in my step, it's a wall. Sprinkler on either side of it as if it was a wall. If it's less than 36 inches, it doesn't exist. So here's what we're saying. If we have a step ceiling less than 36 inches, and you have at least a sprinkler at the higher location, not just at the lower location, that wall or that step does not exist. Just go ahead, go on your way. If it's greater than 36 inches, treat it as a wall. Now you have that maximum 1/2 S distance away from the step on either side of the step. Oh, hey, I get to use this with extended coverage heads too, which is nice. Yeah, you know, before everyone's getting clobbered when you'd have little things like this and somebody'd say, no, you can't use an extended coverage head. The rules for extended coverage heads are going to be much easier to use them. What the installation committee gave you with this step ceiling and some of the other stuff, they have taken away. We're used to this, combustible protection area and maximum area per coverage, how far apart heads can be. If we had combustible obstructed construction with the members greater than 3 feet apart, 168 square feet, that's nothing new. If it's combustible obstructed construction less than 3 feet on center, now you're limited to 130 square feet, still a maximum spacing of 15. Get ready, get ready, get ready. Oh my gosh, you're going to kill me with attics. If you have an attic with a slope greater than 4 and 12 and spacing of members less than 3 feet, which isn't that most attics, okay, you're limited to 120 square feet. You are now limited to a maximum spacing depending on the pressure you're willing to give up at the head. If you can give up 20 psi at the head, you can go 10 by 12. 7 psi, you're limited to 8 by 15, and that smaller dimension is perpendicular to the slope, okay? So that we have heads spaced close enough apart along the slope that as that heat comes up, it's able to catch one of these heads. The original language in this was actually going to require a 0.2 density in all attics. That was the way it originally was written. Instead, it was backed out a little bit. Nah, we can still do 0.1, 7 psi, and 20 psi. This was based on attic sprinkler testing. I think in your handout I wrote CC1 sprinkler testing. The attic sprinkler testing, the Central folks burned all types of attics, and they showed that standard sprinkler layouts don't work in certain configurations. The heads are too far apart along that slope. You don't catch it, you burn the attic off. The original proposal also recommended a maximum spacing of 64 square feet. That would have, I mean, can you imagine what it would have taken to sprinkler most of these attics? And so this is the actual language that was brought in. The test data was reviewed again, and so we were at 120 square feet. Okay, that has some real implications in attic sprinkler design. At the same time, we have to change in these same type of attics, these peak attics, slopes of 4 and 12 or greater, we have to change our layouts that we've been using. We're already doing QRS sprinklers, it's light hazard. We've put quick response sprinklers in there, that's nothing new. You now have to have a row of sprinklers within 12 inches of the peak. No more going down 3 feet, no more sending it over 3 feet or moving it way over. Within a foot, either way of the peak, you have to have some sprinklers. And that set of sprinklers out on the eave, way out on the edge, has to be a maximum of 6 feet out. You cannot keep them way down there because they're covering too much area where the heat will never get to them. And so that's a real issue. You can use some smaller K-factor sprinklers if you wish at that 20 psi in order to reduce your flow, but now you have to use some corrosion-resistant piping. So there's games you're going to have to play with the pressure. So here's what we have for attics and roofs. If the slope is greater than 4 and 12, the structural members are less than 3 feet on center. You have to have a row of heads within 12 inches either way of the peak. The last row of heads out here on the eave, minimum of 6 feet, and some minimum pressures based on how far you're spacing. If you're spacing out 8 feet this way, you can go 7 PSI. If you want to push it to 10 feet apart, you have to go to 20 PSI and be able to provide that pressure. Basically, this wider spacing was the .2 density that the proposal originally looked at for sprinklering.
Say, Rich,
Yes?
on that attic, down the eave now, they have to be a minimum 6 feet out. Is there any consideration then of how high above the bottom of that attic truss you have to be able to develop the spray pattern?
No. Nothing's changing that. That is the change to the guidance. And anything like that, distances to trusses, all that would be the same, no guidance still, unfortunately. There's some other things. The installation committee was busy working on the obstruction requirements, which, I mean, in any design, you almost spend more time on the obstruction requirements than you do anywhere else. So they've clarified some things. The 3 times rule, or 4 times rule, that language in there, whoever wrote that, I mean, should be never allowed to write code language again. This is that rule that said you have to be 3 times away the maximum dimension of the obstruction not to exceed 24 inches. Well, what is the not to exceed 24 inches? Is that the distance away, is that the obstruction? Are you 3 times away the 24 inches? It was never clear. So that's been rewritten to say a minimum distance of 3 times the maximum dimension of the obstruction. The maximum distance you have to be away is 24 inches. Separate sentence. Took all that out, divided it up. There were more interpretations on that. The end result is the same. The distance is away, the intent, all the basic requirements are the same. It's been worded differently just to help you out in interpreting that, just because we're spending way too much time. Ceiling pockets, these are bigger than your skylights. These could be long skylights that run the length of a building, something like that. But when you have pockets created in the ceiling, all ceiling pockets must be protected. But then there's a code section that says unsprinkled ceiling pockets are permitted. This is that language where we're no longer using exceptions, where the language is going to be different. So you have to read the next code section after it. So this would be, .1, this would be .2. If your volume is less than 1,000 cubic feet, depth is less than 36 inches, the floor area is covered by the sprinklers that are down in the lower part of the ceiling, and you keep them 10 feet apart, these pockets 10 feet apart. You've got limited or non-combustible construction, QR sprinklers. You're allowed to just treat that pocket as if it doesn't exist. It's got a cover on it. And so that will make it much easier, especially with extended coverage heads, protecting under those ceiling pockets. You still have to have floor coverage. So that doesn't mean you could have a 50-foot by 50-foot pocket and cover it with sprinklers around the perimeter. I mean, if you got 10-foot coverage, you're limited to certain sizes so that you still have floor coverage the whole way around. Basically, here's what you have. Less than 36 inches, it doesn't exist as long as your floor coverage is complete down below. Those of you that are AFSA members, some of your funding went to pay for these pretty pictures that were done. This was a code change that was done based on computer modeling. And they actually showed with the computer modeling you could do a lot bigger pockets. In other words, continuous pockets the whole way down the building. You could do much deeper pockets. But the installation committee did not feel comfortable enough accepting this based on computer model only, and so they picked a committee number, 1,000 cubic feet and 36 inches depth. Okay, so those were actually shown by modeling that when it's not very deep, the hot gases tend to spread out and will activate my sprinklers there. But gosh, if I make it much deeper, those gases kind of spin around in here and don't make it out to my ceiling sprinkler underneath there. Sidewall sprinklers. If you're, for example, looking in a mall or arcade area outside an office in St. Paul, on Cedar Street, you may notice that you have sidewall sprinklers located to protect areas where they're not at the peak. We've clarified things. If the slope is greater than 2 and 12, you have to install at the high point, position to discharge downward, and it applies to extended coverage heads. So if I have a peak like this, is it okay to put the sprinkler head aiming this way? No, because that's not discharging down the slope. The only acceptable position under a slope ceiling is putting the head at the top and aiming it down. You cannot cover areas like this. If you've got a big open dome, you can't put the heads down around the bottom of the dome and hope they're going to go off someday, because they won't. This is is going to save a lot of people that do storage occupancies and use extended coverage heads a ton of money. If you have extended coverage heads in high pile or extra hazard, before we were ending up having to go with the listing and use a 12 by 12 or a 14 by 14 spacing for the water flow rate, even if we were not spacing them at that distance. Now, you are able to use the actual coverage area. This is what FM Global has been doing. So under the 99, if you have using a 14 by 14 extended coverage head, but you're only using it in a 14 by 8 area, a rectangular area, at a 0.6 density, you had to use 118 gallons per minute. Under the new code, same head, same layout, everything, you can actually just design it for 14 by 8 for your water, and you only need 68 gallons per minute. Pretty.
So a lot of the sprinkler heads right now, extended coverage heads, are listed for those specific areas.
Yeah.
So they're saying even though they're specifically listed that way, you can use them for different coverage?
Yes,
Okay.
under the 2002.
So
Yes. That'll get coordinated. That'll get coordinated soon. You know, once UL figures it out, they buy their copy of the standard, and they go, oh gosh, we have to change this. They should hopefully start changing it. So there's one though. If you're going to use that in the near future, make sure you clarify that with the code official that everyone's okay with using that different flow rate. I mean, it's a lot less water, but at the same time could lead you astray. New section on obstructions for residential sprinklers. When we had residential sprinklers installed according to NFPA 13, for example, in a high-rise building, we didn't know how you handle obstructions. Now there's a specific section. There's one section where there's an error in the numbering, so take your notes home, change that in your copy, so you're not being sent to the wrong section. If you have ESFR sprinklers under say you've got some obstructions, some structural members you're trying to miss, and it doesn't matter how you move them, at the required spacing, you're always going to hit one of these obstructions. You're now able to fudge the ESFR spacing a little bit. So even though it's 10 by 10 ESFR spacing, you can go 11 foot on this one side in order to miss an structural member. Okay. There's some quirks with this rule. I'm simplifying it greatly. If you're going to use it, you got to check on it. For lower storage heights and ceiling heights, we can go 12 feet, 12 foot on ESFR heads, higher ceilings, 10 feet. Distance below the ceiling is now a function of K factor. Much more in this code and much more in the 2006 is going to be a function of K factor. We tested it this one specific way, okay, you can get away 3 to 5. We tested this other head this way, okay, it has to be 3 to 12 inches under the ceiling for the different heads. Oh, hey, this is a great one. Roll-up doors in a warehouse with ESFR sprinkler heads. You can now protect under those roll-up doors with just boring old normal sprinkler heads. You no longer have to put ESFR sprinkler heads under a roll-out door. Concealed spaces. A little reworking on the definition of a concealed space. That's all this is. Nothing substantial, but just defining limited combustible, meaning like paper on drywall. There's always an argument, well, you got drywall on the inside of there. Heck, I can get one great fire going on drywall paper, so you know you have to sprinkler in there. Well, we've clarified that a little bit. If you use composite wood joist construction, those I-beams made out of plywood, okay, they're just plywood. If you wanted to not call those a concealed space and you didn't want a sprinkler in them, the drywall had to be attached directly to the bottom of that member. Now you're allowed to actually have some metal channels and separate that out. Here's what I'm talking about. If I have these engineered plywood I-beam jobbies, before the drywall had to be attached directly to it. Now you can put some little channels and have some separations in there, but you have to have 3.5 inches of insulation on top of the tube. Now you can not call that a combustible concealed space and not have to put lots of sprinklers in it. If you have pipe chases in multiple story buildings, finally, boy, I clobbered somebody once with this one. As long as it's fire stopped at each floor and some penetrations are sealed up and you've got non-combustible piping, that's no longer a concealed space. Somebody got dinged for this, I don't know where. Somebody must have been building a restaurant with a big canopy out front of it and had to install sprinkler heads in a part of the country that freezes down in the supporting columns for that canopy. Imagine getting heads down there. We got rid of that one at least. That's not a concealed space, okay. This is one I don't know how we're gonna work this one out. If you have a concealed space that's horizontal and the depth is less than 36 inches, so a cock loft or an area between floors made out of, 2x4 construction or something, if the slope is less than 2 and 12, and the upper surface is combustible, meaning plywood floor decking, so that the floor above it can be put on it, the sprinklers must be listed for such combustible concealed spaces. So if you have a real narrow so now, the type of sprinkler has to be listed for this combustible concealed space. Well, somebody, I already heard it over there. This is the first of several sections where the code is requiring something, but there is only a single product out there and it has patent protection for that design. And that product cannot protect all scenarios. Think about a product that cannot cover all horizontal combustible concealed spaces at 36 inches. There are certain designs a product cannot cover, yet it's required that you use a product listed for that. So we now will have a case where you may have to fill that with insulation. I don't know of a different option. And so normally the standard, in order to be an ANSI accredited standard, you cannot write the standard to specific products that are, that only one manufacturer sells. That's one of the requirements. And so when it looks like a section is done like this, the manufacturers have been sending in a page and a half of legalese saying, we realize you are now writing in a code section that only applies to a patent we have. We have no intention of ever giving that patent up or selling it to any other manufacturer, and sticking their tongue out at them, and basically saying, but because there are other ways of complying, filling it with insulation, we therefore feel this is not a violation of the ANSI only one manufacturer issue, therefore have a nice day. If you have an exterior exit corridor balcony, this is the old Days Inn or Motel 6, where they've got the exterior balcony the whole way around that's non-combustible. You don't have to sprinkler outside. This is the Chris Cahill amendment. Risers, if your riser is subjected to mechanical damage, or could be, if the riser is out in the warehouse, and that's where they drive the forklifts, you have to put something around it. Too many of them have been dinged. Hanging and bracing, it's boring. The functions are, the type of hangers are now a function of the ceiling material. Well, that's only logical. So all the tables have been divided up. If you're putting it into wood, here's what you can do. If you're putting it into concrete, that's what you can do. And coach screws, you can only go up to 4-inch pipe. That's the only changes. I mean, there's lots of earthquake stuff, but the stuff that was in 24, NFPA 24, that was moved into NFPA 13 in the 99 edition was scattered everywhere. So it's been put together in one chapter. But now, everyone has realized, well, we still want an NFPA 24, so NFPA 24 is coming back. So the material will be in both standards. So stay tuned for that one. Okay, Chapter 11, Design Approaches. This is where the area density, the light hazard, all that stuff is located. And it tells you how to come up with how much water you need, and sends you to Chapter 12 if you have storage, or sends you to Chapter 13 if you have a special design, like a fir vault or a wood-constructed cooling tower on the roof of a building, something weird. Chapter 11, the occupancy hazard design approach. I should say one thing, too, about the numbering. I've included numbering in all these sections so you can go find it again. The 13 means it's in 13. A few slides later, when I talk about 13R, it would say like 13R here. But the actual code section in the book is 11.2 when you go look for it. Okay, you won't see 13- in the book. Area density curves, they were actually gone until an appeal to the Standards Council. The area density curves for everything, storage and the light hazard and ordinary hazard, were all gone, and it was replaced by a point on the curve in a table. In other words, everyone designs for the bottom of the curve anyway. Why are we wasting our time printing pages and pages of curves? Well, a few people had a problem with that, and so they ended up back in the standard. The standard basically was rewritten by the committee over a weekend. And so that was a pretty big issue. If you have ordinary temperature sprinklers with a K factor of 11.2 or greater in storage, you can now take advantage of the curves for high temp sprinklers. Some people did some tests. My prediction, this is a prediction for the next edition of the standard. You're going to probably see for larger K factor sprinkler heads, the K17, K whatever it is, 25 and all that, you'll probably see things reduced commodity classification or reduced densities for those larger K factors. So you may have cardboard boxes, but you get to protect it as a class 2 commodity instead of a class 3. That amount of water. Or the area density curves are going to be a function of K factor. Simply, they're finding out with testing that even more so than sprinkler temperature or commodity classification, sprinkler K factor is important. Host stream, this was actually one, this is a perfect example of a committee number. We brought up, a couple of us, this host stream thing where I have a light hazard school and there's one chemistry lab in there. So now I got to include 250 gallons or 500 gallons for the host stream if I have some extra hazard, even though it's a small area in my overall building. Well, you're now allowed to have up to 400 square feet, as long as each 400 square foot area is not touching, they're separated. You can actually just include the lower host stream in that higher design. So if you have an ordinary hazard mechanical space in a light hazard building, and that mechanical space is 400 square feet or less, you can just use the 100 gallons per minute you would use for the light hazard. This number came from, there's 3 or 4 of us sitting around one night writing the language up, and everyone kind of went, what should we go with? And I said 400, and that's what ended up in there. Because we said, well, 20 by 20 square foot, single head, extended cover, blah, blah, blah. And, so there was no great test data behind this that said 401 square feet is a problem, but 399 is okay. Combustible concealed spaces. Some people still don't get it, and it's still in the code. If you have a combustible concealed space that is not sprinklered, your minimum design area is 3,000 square feet. There's a few exceptions. A couple of them have not changed. 2 of them are new. If you have an area above an isolated room, less than 55 square feet in area, that can be a concealed space that has no sprinkler, and you still don't get dinged to 3,000 square feet. The vertical pipe chase one also. You're allowed to have that in buildings without getting the larger design area. Design approaches, more in Chapter 11. We already talked about that. Oh, hey, yeah, if you do take advantage of the unprotected ceiling pockets, these big skylights or things like that, you cannot also take advantage of the reduction in design area for quick response sprinklers under ceilings that are less than 20 feet. So they give you something, they take away something. So you have to decide on a given job, what is it more important to do? Is it more important for me to be able to sprinkler around this weird step or ceiling pocket, or is it more important for me to keep my water low? Some people were applying that increase of 30% for slope ceilings to storage, and it was made clear that that doesn't apply because the storage protection does not apply to slopes greater than 2 and 12 either. You should not be using the storage requirements for buildings like this that are warehouses. Let's see, design approach. If you're designing residential sprinklers according to 13.1 minimum density, dry system water delivery, you can use a calculation method. That's in there now. Storage has been separated out into its own different chapter, and so when you have idle pallets blocking the fire door, or when you have all types of racks or fun types of storage, you can go to your own chapter. And it's now improved. It's been improved in its readability. The numbering right here of the different sections, palletized, racks, rubber tires, blah, blah, blah. Within each of those sections, all of the numbering is the same within each of them. So within a given one of those blue ones I just had, the point 1 will be general, the point 2 will be class 1 through 4. Within that, each of the head types you can have will be uniform. So each of these sections in the storage chapter now is kind of cut and paste with the specifics for that apply. So if you have rack storage with in-rack sprinklers, the in-rack sprinkler requirements are actually going to be in the section with rack storage. They're not going to be buried somewhere else. So it hopefully will be a little easier to use the standard, but it means a lot of cut and paste. There's lots of new data for wood pallets. As part of this plastic pallet stuff, The folks that sell plastic pallets wanted to show that stacks of wood pallets are bad and require more water, so they submitted data to say, gosh, you need more water, so it's a function of K-factor. Here again, if you have a certain K-factor head, you can store 6 feet high. If you use a different K-factor head, maybe you can store 10 feet high. Here's an example of specific criteria for a specific application type head or an ESFR head. You can use a given density for plastic pallets, so there's now guidance for plastic pallets. Here's my example of specific application control mode sprinkler criteria, that new term. That means use a K16.8 sprinkler to protect class 1 through 4. Here's my height, and here's my number of sprinklers I designed, 15 at 10 PSI. So it's no longer telling you an area density design of 0.6 over 2,000 or something like that. It's telling me density and number of sprinkler heads.
You use a sprinkler head with a larger K factor?
That is going to be a big confusion. Some of the tables say K factor equal to or greater than 16.8. Some of them say 16.8 K factor sprinkler head. So it should be it hopefully will be clear on some of them if you can use the larger one. We included that. If it doesn't, no, you're limited to that head, because that was the only head that had data submitted for the test. Okay, here's the solid shelf stuff that has already started to ruin some people's days. There's a number of consulting firms already doing full-scale testing, getting ready for this one, because a few of the people that have very close shelves in their warehouses have gotten clobbered. If your area is between 20 and 64 square feet for a solid shelf, between a flue space or aisle, you sprinkler every 6 feet. If it's greater than 64 square feet, you sprinkler under every shelf. So if you have very close spaced shelves that are very large, you're going to have a ton of interact sprinklers. It was a quick fix. I actually submitted a proposal to do a little something different with the flue spaces that was all tied into this, and it was felt, well, we can't deal with all this right now, we don't have enough test data, we'll save it to the 2006, but we'll take some of the FM global criteria, not all of it, and put it in the standard. And so for few people, this is really going to mean a lot of interact sprinklers. Slatted shelves, these are a mess. We now have manufacturers coming in with their own special, well, I use this kind of perforated cover on my shelf. Well, I sell something different, and I use this kind of perforated cover on my shelf. We now have code sections written to specific manufacturers or specific big box stores. So if you have, now there's guidance in the code, if you have racks with slats and perforations on top, you can sprinkler it with a K whatever sprinkler to a certain density. The problem is, well, this time they doubled up the coverage right there, so now you don't have, and this is like 40% open average in the holes and that. I mean, it's an enforcement nightmare, and personally it's a mess. I wrote a comment to say get rid of all that, but nobody wanted to listen to me. If you have ESFR sprinkler heads, and you have to put some ESFR sprinkler heads under a big duct or an obstruction, you have to include 2 ESFR sprinkler heads in your design area to account for those. More water. There's some special designs now. This is that area of the code that's special design that's written for certain manufacturers or certain big box stores. We had it in the 99. Remember we had all that slatted shelf stuff in there that certain home stores would use in their designs. Well, the Ford Motor Company was getting clobbered by fire officials all over the place when they'd hang these plastic vehicle components, the rubber bumpers or the foam dashboards or things like that. They hang them on big racks and have them in a warehouse. Well, there's no design criteria. You could maybe say, well, that's exposed, expanded plastics, and so I'll use that number. But they were really running into problems, so they sponsored some testing. Unfortunately, they sponsored the testing before the K25 sprinkler head was really out. They just went to a manufacturer and said, can I have this sprinkler head? It's big, it dumps a lot of water, and I want to go try it. And so they tried it, and they did some weird testing. They had it 18 inches below that ceiling. They used some weird spacings, and they used 16 heads at 37 PSI for the design. And, well, it worked. So they would start submitting this report to fire marshals. Well, I don't like that report. It's not the right color. There's something on the cover of it. So they reject it. And so we want to get this in the code. So they got it in the code. Gordy went and even talked against it, and they didn't want to listen to what we had to say again. That design will protect no other commodity. So if you have a warehouse with that system, and somebody wants to go from storing this stuff to widgets, you tear out all the pipe. There's now a number of rack storage tests that were done for different manufacturers. One company that sells bath towels, another company that sells a general product mix, another company, each of these stores just has a different product. And so they use some special, some K25 sprinklers, but they did the testing, they're sneaky. Oh, yeah, listen to this. Okay, normally when you run tests, if you're gonna go, well, I'm gonna protect this with a 0.6 density. When you test it, they turn up the pump so that all the sprinkler heads that open, every head has a 0.6 density, and you protect the product that way. And you test it, and when it passes the test, you say, this is protected with a 0.6 density. Well, that's the way we've done it. And we know there's a safety factor, because in reality, when only 2 or 4 heads open up, we dump out a lot more water because we have a lot more pressure. Okay? Well, they went, well, let's use that. So now, when they do the test, when the first 4 heads open up, they crank the pump up more, so that it gives a 0.7 density. Then, okay, you opened up more than 4 heads, we'll go down to the 0.6 we planned on. So now, you're back to, remember when we did plastics, you used to have to do 2 sets of calculations, that initial weird calculation of some high density over 900 square feet? We're back to that. If you want to use this head, you have to submit 2 sets of calcs. One is the first 4 hydraulically most remote, and this wasn't clear the first time, but I got them. I submitted a code change that says the hydraulically most remote, meaning 4 heads on one line have to be able to do 0.7. Then after that, you do 0.6. The problem is, many of these fire tests may only open up 4 heads. So they have the pump running at a 0.7 density, they only open up 4 heads, so they guess at this next number. They have not had a fire severe enough to open up 15 heads, so they get to 2,000 square feet, so they can test that. So they just might as well pick 0.3. It doesn't matter. They pulled that number out of the air because of the new way they're conducting these tests, which has reduced another safety factor in the standard. And both of these involve the patent issue. There is a certain manufacturer of that head only, but because you could protect that rack storage with in-rack heads and a foam system, there's still another option in the code. You could protect it with a high expansion foam system, that rack storage. Therefore, there's still another option in the codes. Therefore, there's not a problem if we're the only company that sells that product.
Question.
Yes?
Which one of our brethren are out there creating these nice fat little loopholes that allow deviation from...
Somebody at your table will whisper that in your ear.
I'm dead serious.
Well, this product is manufactured by Central Sprinkler. The attic sprinkler, what has happened is, if you want to come up with a new head, and you run a bunch of tests, and they all fail, you'd normally bury those very deep so nobody knew about them. And then you'd change your head a little bit, it'd pass, so that's what you'd send out. Well, now people are going, well, damn, I spent all that money, I got to use that stuff. So they go, well, let's use that stuff to change the code so that our product is the only one that really works. So then they submit it, and the committees go, well, yeah, you're right. The way we used to put sprinklers in attics didn't work very well. Here's some test data that shows it didn't. So we changed the code. Oh, I'm going to get phone calls after this one. Special occupancies, this is all that weird stuff that comes from other NFPA standards, a standard on oxidizer storage or incinerators or laboratories. If you ever have to design a tipping station for a waste building or trash dumping station or recycling center, there's now data buried in there under power plants because a lot of those run on trash. So they actually have a density they pulled out of here. Everything but NFPA 30 and 30B, aerosols and flammable liquids moved over. Okay, if you have plans and calcs less than 2 inches for flow switches, valves, and meters, find the data because now you have to include it in the calculations. Extra hazard or storage sprinklers,
I thought that was a Futrell rule.
Now, I was hoping Scott was here, because I was gonna say, this is Scott's chapter, and he wasn't. 175 PSI maximum on storage and extra hazard. What we had was some people that were doing the following. In parts of the country, maybe where labor expenses are very, very high, they would say, well, I'm buying a fire pump. Well, why don't I buy a 300 PSI fire pump, or a much higher PSI fire pump? The fittings are only a couple bucks more, and now I hang 1-inch pipe throughout the whole warehouse because I'm running it at 300 PSI and I have a ton of pressure to lose. It was cheaper for them to buy a 300 PSI pump. Well, all you get is a ball of steam when that head opens up. It just and so that has been, we put a stop to that. Water supplies and issues with water supplies. If you have some mic problems, the odor is supposed to now notify you. There's a code section that says they're supposed to notify you.
But not a tree problem.
Not a tree box. That was recent. I test my valves. If you design aircraft carriers or stuff, there's a few changes. No changes to anything else. 13R. 13R and 13D, not much change, other than the density issue. Bathroom's been defined. Thermal barrier defined if you have the area behind a tub. A few people were getting clobbered because 2 tubs would go back to back in adjacent apartments. There would not be a thermal barrier between them, and people were having to design sprinklers in both and all types of things. Looking at more dry pipe and pre-action systems in residential, there's a big issue. It wasn't resolved, but probably in the next edition there'll be some guidance on dry pipe systems for residential occupancies. Minimum density of 0.05, we've all heard about that. You can use a regular sprinkler in a mechanical room. Finally, guidance that says, no, you don't have to include 100 gallons per minute in your 13R calculations. Unless it's outside the area. Garages, yeah, this was always a great one. If you have a garage that only opens up to a single dwelling unit, it's just a room, nothing big, still in 13R. The door is no longer an obstruction. There's specific language that says you don't have to put another sidewall head under the garage door. If it has multiple unit access or is separate from the building, in other words, the building's here and the parking ramp's here, and they're separated, now that's outside 13R, you do all that according to 13. You're going to find that many of the trade-offs, not all, but many, in the building code, the fire code for 13 systems now also apply to 13R systems. So this is another reason for people to install sprinklers, because now the corridor widths can be narrower, the travel distances can be longer, all for 13R systems. You get out from a bunch of other things too. Bathrooms, again, standing with long tradition. Every edition in 13R we changed what you have to do for bathrooms. We've done that again. In the past, it doesn't matter what was going on in a combustible concealed space, we didn't sprinkler it in 13R. If you have fuel-fired equipment in a combustible concealed space, you have to sprinkler it now. Too many fires happening in there. 13D, more on the multi-purpose system, mostly just definitions. This was an area that had many appeals, both on the floor in Minneapolis when the standard was voted on, and to the Standards Council. If you have a softener or a filter, you have to get some sort of bypass around that. Minimum density, same things as with 13R. You don't have to have spare sprinklers with 13D systems. Generally, those are probably not getting back in service that night. They don't have a maintenance person responding out. If you have a foyer outside the building, or a canopy, or a hangover, some architectural thing that hangs over, you have to move. If you have a hanger, you don't need a sprinkler under it. Protection of guidance now in the annex chapter, right? Annex. You don't have to, there's guidance. In many parts of the country that have mandatory 1 and 2 family residential sprinkler installations, the code officials also require a sprinkler in the garage, or some sprinklers in the garage. Now there's guidance for that. One sidewall head you get in the garage, how to do that, and how that allows you to do that.
Question.
Yes?
How do you get 3 separate directions supplied to a sprinkler?
Multi-port fitting
Multi-port
that has 4 things hanging off of it. There's been some change a little bit in how you pipe those with your tubing. in that if you have an open port, you're supposed to go back to another sprinkler with an open port, or go find a home run back to the water supply. Let's see, limited area dwellings, manufactured housing, that one went away. Two people had a problem with that, but not a whole lot. So, as I have documented proof right here, I took this out of my office door at John Eibner and Dave Stigura, finishing up the plan review. No, wait a minute. Is it Eibner and Stigura? Yeah, I'll let you figure it out. So, any questions? What? No, don't take away. I mean, I tried to cover all the major changes. There's a few things in there that are buried in the standard that you still want to look for, but I tried to cover. Excuse me, all of the major changes. Try and give you as much background. Some of it is cynical. I was a fire marshal when I was on the committee working on a lot of this, so I maybe would have a different spin than somebody that was installing or an end user. But a number of changes, some good, some bad. Any other questions? Yes.
Last time you were talking to me about when the 2002 is actually going to become law in Minnesota. I'd like to know that.
Stay tuned. I really wanted to cover at least some of those initial slides to give you a feel for the process with getting a new standard. If we do not go to a hearing, which we will know by Friday, you can look on the State Fire Marshal website probably on Monday or call the rules coordinator. They will let you know whether there's a hearing or not. If there is not, we're probably looking at sometime in December even for the new fire code to be adopted, or January, but it's within the next month.
And that refers to the NFPA 13, 2002?
1999 edition.
Well, that's what I'm getting at. When will we get the 2002?
Well, wait, you're next. If, as part of the public hearing process, people come out and say, no, we don't like the blue document, we want this lighter colored document, and that is changed by this hearing process, then as part of this current code, you would have the 2002 edition. Otherwise, most likely it would be when we adopt the next fire code, maybe 3 years down the line.
Is 5 of us enough?
There is another option.
Yes.
And if you recall what we did with, what was it, the 96? And actually we did it the last two codes, Dave tells me, the other one must have been before my time. We made a determination in the fire marshal's office that O2, in this case, the O2 standard would be a higher standard if you wish to design to the higher standard.
Yep.
Without regard to what it said in the code, you could design to that higher standard.
Yes.
But if you decided to do that, you used the whole 2002 standard.
Yep.
You didn't pick something from 99.
Addicts and all.
Yeah, I mean, you did one or the other. Okay? Now, given past history, I would suspect that we would probably do that again.
Yes.
Okay?
The issue for some installers is not every code official will accept that, nor does that clarify when you install a building, the code official still legally has to enforce the 99. And so although a pocket, you may not need the sprinkler now, if they're saying, no, I'm still enforcing the 99, or that also is a burden for you, for the officials, is now they have to have 2 sets of standards, no 2 sets of standards, in order to do a plan review.
The issue with adopting 99, as it's been explained to me, was at the time the process was begun,
That's exactly what it is. Yes.
you don't know whether you're buying a pig and a poke.
Yes.
Okay? So you adopt a code with a standard that is a known quantity. Okay? And that goes throughout the code document, in a number of areas. It's just not sprinkler protection. There's a number of standards referenced in the new code that there are newer editions of it, but you don't buy something until you know what it looks like. Right.
And one of the requirements with rules adoption is, in order to start moving your rules through the process in the state and all these revisers and people that have to look at it, you have to have a copy of what you're referencing. And so even just 6 months ago, when these rules were going through all the legal process, going to the governor's office, this document wasn't available to hand to them, this was the only one, so that's why you continue to reference. And so, it's not an indication that any certain entity or group does not want one code or the other, but it is simply a realization that at the time a lot of these groups discussed these things, that was the code that was available on the street, and that's what was referenced. It would not be a terribly big change either way, simply because the fire code says sprinkler according to 13. It doesn't say sprinkler according to 13, section 1.2.1.3, and you'd have to go back and change lots of those. And so, no. And so that's why I wanted to at least say, if people are concerned about this or interested, whatever, because we had talked about this, I think, 2 meetings ago, the comment period to express that, and this is something I feel very important is, you know, whatever end users, whether you're a building owner or a code enforcer or everything, you should at least have an opportunity in our system of government to have your voice heard. And this is one of your opportunities to do that. And so if for you or your clients or whatever, that's an important issue, you still have 2 days to let people know. And, you know, if it does go to a hearing, somebody can go into that hearing. It's a public meeting, it's an open meeting, it meets all the open meeting laws. And you can go, I'd like to speak, and I want to recommend that you adopt this. And you know, that's not a big change. It's not like somebody coming in and saying, I want to sprinkler every single doghouse, or I want to sprinkler every, you know, something that's a radical change. That's simply updating a number in Article 45 of the Fire Code. And so if there are, because I felt there would probably be some interest, I did print out the notice and the page. So if you are interested in reading more about that, I do have some copies, and you can come up and get it after the fact, because I had some people last time ask me, well, how do I do that, or where do I look for it? It's on the website, it's on the Fire Marshal's website. Just like with the building code that closed today, the comment period closed today, all of their rules were on their website.
Can you make one more comment about best engineering practices? When I was at the AFSA convention, they were basically talking, the NFPA guy was talking about the fact that if the rule was in the 1999 code, and it's the same rule as in the 2002 code, but it's improved, you really should be using the latest. If it's a totally new section, then you can't until it becomes law.
Yeah, really what you are held to, both as a designer, as a contractor, installer, and code enforcer, all those people are held to what's legally adopted. In Minnesota, that is currently the 1996 edition with amendments. Anytime you say any of these codes, you really have to go, comma, as amended, because 13 is amended in Minnesota. It's very small currently, but I wanted to impress upon everyone that the next edition, the 1999 edition, right here, that we'll be adopting either this month or maybe next month if there's a hearing, will have significant amendments made in the base of the code and state amendments also written. So you really need 3 documents. You need this, you need the fire code, and you need the state amendments. And you have to compare them all. So best practices, actually, if you say you're a licensed engineer, the engineering licensing language says you should meet the current adopted codes in the state, the legally adopted codes in the state, which would be the 1996 edition of 13. Now, you could say it's good practice to use the more current one, because this edition includes a few fixes. We knew that 45-foot high ceilings with 40 foot of storage, certain ESFR sprinkler conditions didn't work. In the 96, in the 99, it says you can do that. In the 2000, it says now you need 1 level of interact. So you're going to see a few changes like that in the past maybe there's systems that are installed currently that we now found with additional testing don't work. So that has been corrected. That would be a perfect example to justify using the new code. It means more money, but it means a higher level of safety, because we found a problem. Plastic pallets would be an example. We found a problem with some testing, and so now if you have certain plastic pallets, you may need to advise a client, you need to provide extra water.
You approve something that doesn't work in between 2 codes, will the retrofit rate to be required?
No, generally, the codes are enforced both here and the intent of 13, that language, that's that retroactivity clause in the front of the code that nobody ever looks at in Chapter 1 of NFPA 13, means if you installed it according to what the document and the guidance was at the time you installed it, that's allowed to remain or continue in effect without having to go back and change it. There are certain operational features, however, and that's where the fire code comes in that says, yeah, but if you move around how you're storing your flammable liquids, you may need to change your protection. But it's basically saying you don't have to go upgrade your sprinkler heads every time a new code is adopted. Otherwise, we continue to install new alarm systems and sprinklers every 3 years in every building.
Even though you have proved
Well,
the installed system will not give the protection.
That's the $64,000 question. Here, the 40-foot high ceiling, 40-foot of rack storage protected with ESFR, K14 ESFR heads. The initial testing was done with the igniter, the little bag of gasoline they use, in the center of the flue spaces, the longitudinal and the transverse flue space. Okay, that's where they lit the little bag of gasoline on fire. System put it out, worked fine. It was great. Submit that test result. It went in the standard, the 1996 edition of the standard. Well, somebody happened to do a few more tests to just look at things, and they moved the igniter into the middle of the transverse flue space, halfway between the aisle and the longitudinal flue space. 2 pallets. System failed. It opened up 25, 30 ESFR sprinkler heads. Okay? It's that sensitive to ignition location, yet most of the test data is only coming in with a single ignition location. So that identified a weakness in the type of tests we were running and the type of data we were accepting. So then the test was rerun with one level of in-racks, and it put the fire out, so that became the standard. So that means maybe a year ago you installed that exact system that we know works for some ignitions but not all. Maybe that means letting a client know that they may want to consider an upgrade because additional testing has shown that that system, although it met the code when you installed it, and you probably don't have a fire marshal coming out and telling you to fix it, it would be prudent now because you cannot guarantee all fires start in the cross-section of the flue spaces. Long answer, sorry. Good questions. Great questions. Oh, Gordy.
Maybe it's just me, but I think, NFPA 13 is getting so complicated, especially with the equipment manufacturers getting their little...
The special listings on everything.
The end user like Ford.
Yep.
Has NFPA talked about addressing that, maybe
Yes.
limiting?
That was our intent with getting rid of all the area density curves. How many times, as a code official, have you looked at an area density curve and somebody comes up with a density of 0.37 over 2,000? You go back to the curves, you work through all the add 30, minus 20, all this. There's no way you ever match that number. If they're providing more water, you close the book and you go, that's fine. The majority of the cases, it's less water, for some reason. And so that's a real problem, that calculation process. The feeling is generally sometimes in some organizations, not everyone maybe is fully trained in how to come up with those numbers. So since everyone picks the bottom number anyway, why don't we just put a simple table so that 20 pages of curves, A curve, B curve, C curve, F curve, for all those would be one table. Here's one commodity, class 2 commodity, class 3 commodity, class 4 commodity. Go to your storage height. There's your density, the 0.37. We had distilled 30 pages of the code down to 2 pages. A couple people had a problem with that, got the floor vote to go their way, and so all those curves are back in there. That was a simplification we tried to do. The housekeeping changes of reorganizing the standard were intended to bring it. There is no solution, and I do not see a solution coming for all of these special listings, special spacings. In fact, I see it getting much worse because I hear of some of the testing that's currently going on. And so that's where things like pallet storage height are now a function of K factor. It's not just a factor of sprinkler density, it's a factor of sprinkler density and sprinkler K factor. So 0.6 density out of a 1730 seconds head is not going to be acceptable, but a 0.6 density out of a K17 head would be, for the same pallet storage height. No, it's going the other way, and I don't see any mandate to do that. I mean, people could make recommendations to simplify the code, but I have not seen anything like that. Yes? If the guidance is within 13, including storage and all those special hazards, I really see that still remaining with a designer or a contractor, not the engineer of record. Some states have mandated it as being something that the engineer of record puts the criteria together, you know, the 0.6 over 2,000, 10 feet apart, whatever, and then the designer takes that information and implements it on the plans. But from the 13 standpoint, no. That's something that's outside the scope of 13. Who does the work? And that's left to the engineering licensing boards and the state contracting boards to duke out for each state. So I don't think, that's not something I would see 13 get involved in, as saying that's what you need to do. Here's the question. Does whatever state you're in, does your state licensing board consider design according to the standard? So if the criteria is coming out of NFPA 13, is that within the contractor licensing law? If you're using criteria outside that standard, like an FM standard or the fire code, is that still within the purview of the contractor licensing, or is that now the work of the licensed engineer? And that's one that needs to be clarified. More data is now in 13, but not everything. And so, yes, you may have a situation that because the data is coming out of the fire code for flammable liquids, that it may actually need to be coming from the engineer of record. I don't have a good answer for that. Any tap dancing around that one? It probably, that's a great thing. If you have a question, ask for an interpretation from one of the boards, written interpretation. It's a good question. I mean, that's a serious issue. A lot of HJs are starting to move to say, you have gone outside the scope of 13, therefore I would like an engineer of record to sign off on this. Oh gosh, never heard that. Never heard that. No. Is that a good? Have you? Okay. All right.
I didn't hear the question.
The question was, is there already proposals for this 2006 edition of 13 to drop the definition of AHJ from 13? Which I think the comment cycle period starts in 2005, so you have plenty of time to get that one wordsmithed. No, I have not heard anything. I know of no proposal in the 2002 edition to that effect. May have been buried, but I don't recall seeing that. Well, have we beaten this subject enough? If there are questions, there were some cards. Some people got a copy of my card. I've got additional cards up here. And so I'll certainly give you a card if you want to follow up on anything or talk to me about something else. So thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Richard.
Yes.